I used to be the one holding the shock maul. I was the enforcer who dragged people from their habs and told them they were serving the Emperor now. I thought I understood what that meant. I thought I was one of the good ones, one of the necessary cogs that kept the Imperium functioning. Then they came for me, and I learned that in the Emperor's machinery, there are no good ones. There are only those who have been consumed, and those who are waiting. My name is Vex Corian, and I was an enforcer on Hive Secundus for 8 years. Not a long career by enforcer standards, but long enough to believe I had seen the worst humanity had to offer. Long enough to convince myself that the violence I administered was justified, that the terror I inspired was necessary, that the system I served was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. I wore black carapace armor that gleamed under the flickering lumens. I carried a shock maul that hummed with restrained violence. I had the authority to beat, arrest, or kill anyone in the lower hive levels, and I exercised that authority with what I believed was appropriate restraint. I had an apartment in Enforcer Block 12, 3 levels above the habitation zones I patrolled. It had running water most days, a cot that wasn't infested, and a window that looked out over the industrial sector where the refineries burned day and night, painting the sky in shades of orange and gray. I had a locker where I kept my equipment clean and maintained. I had a routine that involved 12-hour shifts, mandatory combat drills every 3rd day, and enough ration credits to eat something better than protein paste twice a week. I had colleagues who respected me, superiors who noted my efficiency, and a record clean enough that I was being considered for promotion to sergeant. I thought I was safe. I thought my service to the Imperium, my 8 years of maintaining order and enforcing the law, meant something. I thought the tithe would never reach me because I was already serving. I was wrong on every count. The tithe came on a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesdays were my rotation to process new arrests in the detention block, and I was halfway through logging a drug smuggler's biometrics when the doors exploded inward. Not opened. Exploded. The reinforced plasteel doors that were designed to withstand riot conditions were torn from their hinges by breaching charges, and armed figures in void black armor stormed through the smoke. For a single absurd moment, I thought we were under attack. Then I saw the Aquila on their shoulder plates and I understood. This was not an attack. This was collection. They were Militarum Tempestus, stormtroopers who operated outside the normal chain of command, and they moved with a precision that made our enforcer training look like children playing soldier. They carried hellguns that could punch through our carapace armor like it was paper, and they wore full-sealed combat armor with rebreather units and targeting visors. One of them, a sergeant with a voice amplified by his helmet's voxcaster, ordered us to stand down and prepare for assessment. He did not say assessment for what. He did not need to. I watched as they pulled up data slates and began reading names. My colleagues, men and women I had worked beside for years, were called forward one by one. Some went quietly. Others protested, citing their service records, their positions, their value to the Hive security apparatus. The stormtroopers did not care. When an enforcer named Carrick refused to comply, when he drew his shock maul and took a defensive stance, they shot him. One hellgun round through the chest. He was dead before he hit the floor, and the smell of cauterized flesh filled the detention block. The sergeant repeated his order. We complied. They called my name third. Vex Corian, Enforcer 2nd Class, badge number 7739, KV. I stepped forward because I had watched Carrick die and I understood that compliance was survival. They scanned my biometrics with a handheld device, cross-referenced something on a data slate, and told me I had been selected for immediate induction into the Astra Militarum. I asked on what authority. The sergeant pointed to the Aquila on his armor and told me that was all the authority that existed in the Imperium. I asked if I could retrieve my personal effects. He told me that my personal effects were now property of the Administratum and that I had 30 seconds to remove my enforcer armor before they removed it for me. I stripped. We all did. 30 men and women who had spent years enforcing the Imperium's will, reduced to standing in our undergarments in the middle of the detention block we had controlled hours earlier. They gave us gray fatigues that smelled like disinfectant and boots that were stiff and ill-fitting. They gave us 10 seconds to dress. Then they herded us into armored transports with shock mauls and the casual threat of violence, and I realized with a sick clarity that I had done this to hundreds of people. That I had been on the other side of this process, dragging conscripts from their homes, and that I had told myself it was necessary. That I had been part of this machinery without understanding what the machinery did to those it consumed. The transport was designed to carry 40 people. They packed 80 of us inside. Not just enforcers, but also administratum clerks, factory supervisors, medici staff, even a junior officer from the Planetary Defense Force. All of us selected by whatever algorithm the administratum used to determine who was expendable. We stood pressed against each other in the dark, the air growing thick and foul within the first hour. There were no viewports, no indication of where we were going. Just the rumble of the transport's engine and the occasional lurch as we took corners too fast. A woman beside me, a medici nurse named Selris, asked if anyone knew what was happening. An enforcer from another precinct, a man named Thorm who I recognized but had never worked with, laughed. It was a sound like breaking glass. He said we were being tithed, that the Imperium had demanded bodies and we were the bodies being delivered. He said his brother had been tithed 6 years ago and had lasted 3 months before being killed on some world whose name he couldn't even pronounce. Selris asked why they would take trained personnel, people with specialized skills. Thorm laughed again and said that the guard didn't need specialized skills. It needed bodies that could hold a lasgun and walk toward the enemy. Everything else was luxury. The transport journey lasted 5 days. They gave us no food for the first 36 hours, then dropped ration bars through a slot in the ceiling. Dense, chemical-tasting blocks that were calculated to provide minimum sustenance. They gave us no water for the first 48 hours, then provided a single canteen for every 20 people. We rationed it carefully, taking small sips, but by the 3rd day the canteen was empty and our throats were raw and swollen. People collapsed. The elderly administratum clerks went first, their bodies unable to sustain the conditions. They fell and we could not move them because there was no room, so we stood on them or beside them, and we felt them go still beneath our feet. When the transport finally stopped and the ramp lowered, the light that poured in was so bright it felt like a weapon. We stumbled out into a hangar that was larger than any structure I had seen, a space so vast the ceiling disappeared into darkness above us. Servitors moved among us, their augmented limbs clicking and whirring, attaching identification tags to our wrists with mechanical precision. The tags were metal bands that bit into the skin, stamped with numbers longer than any identification code I had carried as an enforcer. A voice boomed from Voxcasters, instructing us to form ranks and proceed to processing. We moved because there was no alternative. Processing was systematic dehumanization dressed as bureaucracy. They stripped us again, this time in a chamber with walls of bare ferrocrete and drains set into the floor. Hundreds of us, pressed together, our bodies pale and malnourished. They hosed us down with chemical spray that burned the skin and filled my mouth with a taste like battery acid. The water was ice cold, delivered from ceiling-mounted nozzles with such force it felt like being beaten. I stood there shivering, my arms wrapped around my body, and I remembered hosing down prisoners in the detention block after processing. I had thought I was being efficient, that I was following protocol. I had never considered what it felt like to be on the receiving end. They shaved our heads with electric clippers that caught and tore, leaving bloody furrows across my scalp. My hair, which I had kept regulation short as an enforcer, fell in clumps onto the wet floor, mixing with the hair of hundreds of others. A woman beside me was crying, her hands pressed to her bare skull, and a servitor simply pushed her aside and continued processing the line. They injected us with needles, long and brutal, slamming them into arms and necks without explanation. Some injections made my vision blur. Others left me shaking and feverish, my heart racing so fast I thought it would tear itself apart. Selris, the medici nurse, asked what they were injecting. A servitor told her to be silent or be sedated. She was silent. They tattooed a number onto my forearm, black ink etched deep into the skin with a machine that felt like it was carving bone. The number was longer than my enforcer badge, a string of digits that reduced 8 years of service and a lifetime of identity to a data point in some unimaginable ledger. They scanned us with handheld devices, recording our biometrics, our bone density, our muscle mass, our visual acuity. They were cataloging us like equipment, assessing our utility, determining which parts of the Imperial war machine we would fit into. A man refused to open his mouth for the oral scan, clenching his jaw in what I recognized as futile defiance. They broke his jaw with a punch from an augmented servitor fist and scanned him anyway. His screams echoed through the processing chamber, and no one reacted. We had all learned that resistance was meaningless. They issued us uniforms. Gray fatigues that smelled like disinfectant and fit no one properly, the fabric rough against skin still raw from chemical wash. They gave us boots that were stiff and poorly sized, the leather cracking when I flexed my toes. They gave us ration packs, compressed blocks that tasted like salted cardboard, and canteens filled with water that had a metallic aftertaste. They told us we were now property of the Astra Militarum, that our lives belonged to the God Emperor, and that any failure to comply with orders would result in immediate execution. A commissar appeared, a figure in a long black coat with a peaked cap and a bolt pistol holstered at his hip, and he confirmed this by executing a man who asked about contact with family. 1 shot to the head. The body dropped. We were ordered to proceed to the barracks. We stepped over the corpse. The barracks was a warehouse converted for mass habitation. Rows of cots arranged with geometric precision, stretching into the distance until they blurred into lines of gray and shadow. The air was cold and smelled like mold and unwashed bodies. We were given 10 seconds to find a cot and claim it. I found one near a wall, thinking proximity to structure might offer some marginal sense of security. The mattress was thin and hard, the blanket smelled like mildew, but I collapsed onto it and felt relief so profound it was almost painful. I had been standing for 5 days. My legs were swollen and cramping. My feet were blistered and bleeding inside my new boots. I closed my eyes and told myself I just needed to sleep, that sleep would make this more manageable. I was wrong. The klaxons blared 2 hours later. I had barely descended into unconsciousness when the sound tore through the barracks, a mechanical shriek that bypassed thought and went straight to the nervous system. We scrambled from our cots, disoriented and terrified, and servitors entered the barracks and herded us outside with shock prods. It was still dark. The air was cold enough to turn breath into fog. We assembled in a parade ground that stretched for kilometers, a flat expanse of ferrocrete that radiated cold up through the soles of our boots. There were thousands of us, arranged in blocks of 100, and at the front of each block stood a drill instructor in a uniform adorned with rank insignia I did not recognize. Our instructor was a veteran named Sergeant Halrick. He was a short, heavily muscled man with a face that looked like it had been assembled from scar tissue and fury, and his voice could cut through any noise. He paced in front of our formation, his boots striking the ferrocrete with sharp cracks, and he studied us with undisguised contempt. He told us we were the lowest form of life in the Imperium, lower than groks, lower than the sewage that accumulated in the Underhive. He told us that the only reason we had not been executed on the spot was because the Emperor needed bodies to feed into the war machine, and that our training would determine whether we were worth the resources invested in us. He told us that most of us would not survive training, that we would die from exhaustion or injury or simple failure, and that those who did survive would wish they had not. Then he ordered us to run. We ran. The parade ground encircled a training complex, and one lap was approximately 8 kilometers. Halrick ran alongside us on a motorized cart, shouting corrections and insults, and when someone fell, he would stop and kick them until they got up or stopped moving. We ran until the sun rose, and then we kept running. My enforcer training had included physical conditioning, but this was different. This was not about building strength or endurance. This was about breaking us down, teaching us that our bodies were not our own, that we would push them past any reasonable limit because the alternative was punishment or death. People collapsed. The administratum clerks went first, their sedentary lives leaving them unprepared for this brutality. Then the factory supervisors, the medici staff, anyone whose profession had not required constant physical exertion. Thorm, the enforcer who had been on the transport, lasted longer than most. He kept pace beside me for the first 2 laps, his breathing controlled, his stride efficient. On the 3rd lap, he stumbled. On the 4th, he fell. Halrich's cart stopped beside him. I heard the sound of the shock maul connecting, heard Thorm scream, and I kept running because stopping meant I would be next. By the time Halrich finally called a halt, we had been running for 4 hours. Of the 100 people in our formation, 23 had collapsed and been removed by servitors. We did not see them again. Halrich told us we had run 32 kilometers, that tomorrow we would run 40, and that by the end of the first month we would run 80 without rest. He did not smile when he said this. We limped back to the barracks and I collapsed onto my cot without removing my boots, and I fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning in black water. The days blurred into a continuous nightmare. We woke before dawn to the blare of klaxons, assembled in the dark, and ran until our legs gave out or the sun reached its peak, whichever came first. Then we drilled. They gave us wooden rifles and made us practice movements that seemed designed to have no practical purpose. Raise the stock to the shoulder. Sight down the barrel. Lower. Repeat. Thousands of times, until the motion became automatic, until our muscles screamed and our shoulders burned, and we continued because Halrich's shock maul was always there, always ready to remind us that weakness was unacceptable. We learned to march in formation. Not the purposeful stride of enforcers moving to contain a disturbance, but a synchronized, mechanical movement where individual thought was subsumed into collective action. We practiced turning in unison, presenting arms, about facing, and the repetition was mind-numbing. Halrich would stop us mid-drill and single someone out for having their head turned a half-degree too far left, and he would beat them in front of the formation while explaining that precision was survival, that in battle the only thing standing between a guardsman and death was the discipline to follow orders exactly. We crawled through obstacle courses where the mud was mixed with broken glass and industrial runoff. The liquid burned exposed skin and the glass cut through our uniforms, leaving us bleeding and poisoned. A man named Darius, who had been a quality control inspector in a munitions factory, caught himself on a piece of rebar that tore through his abdomen. He screamed for help, his hands pressed against the wound, and Halrich walked over and looked at him and told the rest of us to keep moving. Darius screamed for 3 minutes before he passed out. His body was still hanging from the rebar when we finished the course. Servitors retrieved it while we were being hosed down. They introduced us to the Losgun in the 3rd week. We assembled in a long, low building that smelled like ozone and machine oil, and the weapons were laid out on tables, hundreds of them arranged with geometric precision. Halrich told us that the Losgun was the standard armament of the Imperial Guard, that more enemies of humanity had been killed by Losguns than any other weapon in existence, and that we would learn to care for our Losguns with more devotion than we had ever shown to anything in our lives. He picked up a weapon and demonstrated its components. The barrel assembly, the focusing crystal, the power pack port, the trigger mechanism. He moved through the disassembly process with casual expertise, laying each piece on the table, and then he reassembled it in under 10 seconds. He told us we had 1 hour to memorize the process. Then he handed us Losguns and ordered us to disassemble them. I had handled weapons as an enforcer, but those had been solid-state shock mauls and shotguns with minimal moving parts. The Losgun was more complex, its components precisely engineered, and I fumbled with the focusing crystal, nearly dropping it. The man beside me, a former enforcer named Ulrich, completed the disassembly faster than I did. Halrich noticed. He told Ulrich his speed was impressive but his technique was sloppy, that he had failed to check the power coupling for debris, and that in combat such sloppiness would result in a malfunction that would get him killed. Then he beat Ulrich with the shock maul until Ulrich's nose was broken and blood covered his face. We learned to disassemble and reassemble the Losguns until we could do it blindfolded, until our fingers moved through the process without conscious thought. We learned to load and unload the power packs, small rectangular cells that fed energy to the weapon, and Halrich timed us, demanding that we complete the process in under 3 seconds. Anyone who failed was made to do push-ups until their arms gave out, and then they were made to do more. We fired at target ranges, and the lost bolts cracked through the air with a sound like breaking glass, and the targets exploded into showers of fused ceramic. The recoil was negligible, but the heat buildup was intense, and after 100 shots the barrel glowed red and the air around it shimmered. Halric taught us to fire in controlled bursts, to conserve ammunition, to aim for center mass because headshots were a fantasy sold in propaganda. We learned to maintain our weapons, to clean the focusing crystals with specialized solution, to check the power couplings for corrosion, to replace worn components. Halric inspected our lost guns daily, and any weapon that showed signs of poor maintenance resulted in punishment. A woman named Kessa, who had been an archival clerk, failed to clean her focusing crystal properly, and Halric made her run 20 laps around the parade ground carrying her lost gun above her head. She collapsed on the 14th lap and was dragged to the Medici Bay. We did not see her again. I learned to care for my lost gun with a meticulousness I had never applied to my enforcer equipment. I cleaned it every night, even when exhaustion made my hands shake, even when I could barely keep my eyes open. I checked every component, every connection, every seal. The lost gun became an extension of my body, a tool I understood better than I understood myself. And I realized that this was the point, that Halric was not teaching us to maintain weapons but teaching us to surrender our individuality, to become components ourselves, interchangeable parts in the Imperial war machine. The nights were psychological torture. The barracks housed 500 people, rows of cots arranged so close that you could hear every breath, every sob, every whispered prayer. Men wept into their pillows, trying to muffle the sound, but the silence amplified everything. Some prayed to the Emperor, reciting litanies from childhood, their voices cracking with desperation. Others sat on the edges of their cots and stared at nothing, their minds retreating into places the training could not reach. I tried to sleep, but exhaustion was not the same as rest. My body would collapse but my mind would keep running, replaying the day in fractured loops, imagining all the ways I might fail tomorrow. People broke. Mentally and physically, they simply stopped functioning. A man named Yevrik, who had been a mid-level administratum functionary, stood up during morning formation and started screaming that he wanted to go home, that he had a family, that this was illegal. The commissar appeared, the same one who had executed the man on our first day, and he shot Yevrik in the head without breaking stride. The body dropped. We were ordered to resume formation. We stepped over it. A woman named Talus slit her wrists with a piece of broken glass she had hidden from the obstacle course. They found her in the shower block, her blood mixing with the water and running down the drains. Halric assembled us and explained that suicide was cowardice, that Talus had failed the Emperor, and that her name would be stricken from all records. Then he ordered us to run 50 kilometers as punishment for her weakness. The food was engineered to sustain but never satisfy. We ate in a mess hall that could seat thousands, long tables arranged in rows, and servitors ladled gray slop into our trays with mechanical indifference. The slop was protein paste mixed with grain filler, and it had the texture of wet concrete and a taste that made my stomach rebel even as I forced it down. The portions were calculated to keep us functional but constantly hungry. Men fought over scraps, a piece of bread, a spoonful of extra paste, and Halric watched these fights with approval. He explained that aggression was a virtue, that we needed to learn to take what we wanted because the battlefield would offer nothing freely. I avoided the fights at first. My enforcer training had taught me that controlled violence was professional, but uncontrolled violence was dangerous. But the hunger was relentless, gnawing at my stomach, filling my thoughts with fantasies of food. In the 4th week, a man tried to take my ration bar. He was smaller than me, a former factory worker, and he grabbed the bar from my tray while I was distracted. I reacted without thinking, grabbing his wrist and twisting until something cracked. He screamed and dropped the bar, and I hit him twice more, hard enough to break his nose and split his lip. Blood sprayed across the table. Halric walked over, looked at the man's injuries, and told me I had shown appropriate force. Then he gave me the man's entire ration as a reward. I ate it. I felt no guilt. The enforcer who had believed in measured response was gone, erased by hunger and training and the understanding that weakness was death. I was learning the lessons Halric wanted to teach, and I hated myself for how quickly I learned them. The indoctrination was constant and unavoidable. Every third day, we were marched to an auditorium where a mini-storm priest delivered sermons about the glory of the Imperium and the righteousness of our cause. The priest was an ancient man with a voice amplified by vox enhancers, and he wore robes embroidered with scripture and carried a staff topped with a golden aquila. He told us that humanity was besieged on all sides by xenos, filth, and heretical traitors, that the galaxy was a battlefield where only the faithful could prevail, and that our deaths would be offerings to the God Emperor who sat upon the golden throne and protected us from the darkness beyond. He showed us picked recordings of battles. Grainy footage of guardsmen charging across fields of fire, their lost guns blazing, and the narrator spoke of courage and sacrifice as if those words had meaning. The footage was edited, of course. It showed heroic charges and righteous victories, but it never showed the guardsmen who fell in the first volley, never showed the screaming wounded or the shattered bodies. It was propaganda, carefully crafted to inspire rather than inform, and I recognized it for what it was because I had been part of the enforcement apparatus that distributed such propaganda. I had arrested people for possessing unsanctioned materials, had beaten them for questioning the Imperium's narrative. Now I was on the receiving end, and I understood with bitter clarity that I had been a tool used to maintain a lie. The priest told us that pain was sanctifying, that suffering was proof of devotion, and that the guardsman who died in service was elevated to a place of honor in the Emperor's sight. He said this with such conviction that some of the recruits wept, their faces shining with something that looked like hope or faith, or maybe just desperation. I felt nothing. The words washed over me like noise, and I realized that I had stopped believing. Not because I doubted the Emperor's existence, but because I no longer believed that our suffering had meaning, that our deaths would matter, that any of this was anything more than machinery consuming humans and calling it holy. The training intensified in the second month. We moved from basic drills to live-fire exercises, advancing across open ground while targets popped up at random intervals, and lost bolts sizzled past my head close enough to feel the heat. The training was supposed to teach us to react under fire, to trust our training, to keep moving forward. What it actually taught us was that the Imperium had no regard for our lives, that training casualties were acceptable losses, and that we were expendable even before we reached the battlefield. Men were hit. Their uniforms scorched, their skin blistered, and they were dragged off the field while Halric screamed that they had been too slow, too hesitant, too weak. A man named Jorik took a bolt to the leg, the coherent light punching through his thigh and cauterizing the wound instantly. He fell screaming, and I ran past him because stopping meant I might be next. They took him to the Medici bay and removed his leg. He was discharged from training and reassigned to some menial labor position. Halric told us Jorik was lucky, that he would live while the rest of us would probably die, and that we should envy his injury. We practiced bayonet charges, fixing the long blades to the ends of our lost guns and running full sprint toward padded dummies. We screamed as we ran, a wordless roar that Halric said would intimidate the enemy and suppress our own fear. We drove the blades into the dummies' bodies, and Halric walked among us, correcting our form, showing us how to twist the blade to maximize damage, how to pull it free without getting stuck. He demonstrated on a live prisoner, a man who had been convicted of some crime I never learned, and the prisoner's screams were instructional, Halric explaining which angles produced which sounds, which wounds were immediately fatal and which would take minutes or hours. We learned to throw grenades, primitive frag explosives that detonated with a roar and sent shrapnel whining through the air. The first time I pulled the pin and threw one, I felt a sick exhilaration that I immediately hated. The explosion was visceral, the concussion slapping against my chest, and the target dummy was torn to pieces, and I understood that this is what the weapons we were learning to use did to living bodies. That somewhere, on some battlefield, I would throw these explosives at people who were just like me, conscripted and trained and terrified, and they would die screaming and I would be told it was righteous. We were taught to dig trenches, to construct firing positions, to move under cover. Every lesson was accompanied by Halric's insistence that these skills were not theoretical, that soon we would be using them to stay alive while others tried to kill us. We dug in scorching heat and in freezing cold, using entrenching tools that raised blisters and broke calluses, and we learned that the ground was both cover and grave, that the difference was often just a matter of timing. The casualty rate accelerated. We had started with 100 people in our formation. By the end of the second month, we had 47. The rest were dead, injured beyond recovery, or had simply disappeared. Halric never acknowledged the losses. He simply adjusted the formation and continued training, and replacement recruits were occasionally folded in from other formations that had been depleted even faster than ours. I learned to view death with detachment. To see a man collapse during a run and feel nothing, to watch someone fail an exercise and be beaten and register it only as information to avoid similar failure. I learned to stop using names, to see the people around me as temporary occupants of space, entities that would probably be gone soon and were therefore not worth emotional investment. I learned to function on autopilot, to load and fire and reload without thinking, to follow orders without processing them. And I told myself this was survival, that this was what it took to reach the end of training. The final test came in the 12th week. We were woken in the middle of the night and marched to a transport hangar where Valkyrie assault carriers waited with their engines idling and their ramps lowered. Halric told us we were being deployed to a live combat zone, that this was our final evaluation, and that those who survived would be inducted into their regiments. He did not elaborate on what the combat zone was or what enemy we would be facing. We boarded the Valkyries in silence. The flight was turbulent. The Valkyrie shook and rattled, the fuselage groaning under stress, and I gripped the crash harness until my knuckles turned white. The interior was cramped and dark, lit only by red emergency lumens, and the air smelled like promethium and recycled sweat. The man beside me, Ulrich, the former enforcer whose nose Halric had broken weeks ago, asked if I thought we would survive this. I told him I did not know. He laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and said that was the most honest answer he had heard since we had been conscripted. The Valkyrie touched down with a bone-jarring impact, and the ramp dropped, and sound rushed in like a physical force. Explosions. Screaming. The crack of lost gun fire. The roar of something inhuman. We were herded out into chaos. The landscape was a nightmare of shattered rockcrete and burning wreckage, the ground churned into mud by bombardment, and the sky was a sickly orange, choked with smoke and ash. Veterans were dug into positions, their lost guns spitting bolts into the darkness, and the darkness was firing back. Halric appeared, bellowing orders, and we formed a ragged line and moved forward toward a trench system that was under assault. I could see shapes in the smoke, low and hunched, their silhouettes wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The veterans ahead of us opened fire, and the shapes convulsed and fell, but there were more. Always more. Halric shoved a fresh power pack into my hands and told me to fire. I raised my lost gun, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was negligible, but the sound was deafening, and I did not see what I hit, only that the shapes kept coming. We fired until the power packs ran dry, and then we reloaded, fumbling with the fresh cells, and we fired again. Men fell around me, their bodies torn apart by projectiles I could not see, and I stepped over them because stopping meant dying. The lost bolts cut through the smoke, coherent light burning through whatever flesh they hit, and the smell of ozone and burnt meat filled the air. The enemy pressed forward in waves, and we held the line because retreating was not an option. I fired until my lost gun overheated and refused to cycle, and I picked up another weapon from a corpse and kept shooting. The shapes resolved into creatures as they got closer, things with too many limbs and faces that were all teeth and eyes. I recognized them from the indoctrination sessions. Tyranids. Gene-engineered horrors that existed only to consume biomass. And we were the biomass they wanted. A creature broke through the line and lunged at me, its claws extended, its mouth opening to reveal rows of crystalline teeth. I stabbed it with my bayonet, driving the blade into its thorax, and it shrieked and clawed at me, tearing through my uniform and scoring my chest. I twisted the blade and pulled it free, and the creature collapsed, its limbs spasming, and I kept moving because there were more behind it. The fighting lasted for hours, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning in the chaos. The creatures came in waves, and we fired until there were no more power packs, and then we fought with bayonets and rifle stocks and improvised weapons. I beat a creature to death with a rock, feeling its carapace crack under repeated impacts, and I felt nothing. No horror, no guilt, no triumph. Just the mechanical understanding that it had tried to kill me and I had killed it first. When the enemy finally withdrew, we were ordered to hold the trench and wait for reinforcement. The trench was ankle-deep in water mixed with blood and other fluids I did not want to identify. Bodies lay in heaps, some of them recruits, others veterans, and the smell was so overpowering that I vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach. I crouched in the trench and tried to reload my loss gun, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the power pack 3 times. Ulrich was beside me, his face covered in blood that wasn't his, and he was laughing. High-pitched, hysterical laughter that wouldn't stop. I told him to shut up. He didn't. A veteran slapped him hard enough to knock him down, and the laughter stopped. Reinforcements arrived at dawn. Fresh guardsmen from established regiments, moving with practiced efficiency, setting up heavy weapon emplacements and establishing firing lanes. An officer appeared, a lieutenant with a bionic eye and a voice that cut through the noise, and he ordered us to fall in. We climbed out of the trench, and I looked back at the bodies we were leaving behind, and I realized that no one was going to retrieve them. They would rot where they fell, another layer of organic matter ground into the soil of this unnamed world. We were marched to a staging area where other survivors were gathering. Halric appeared and informed us that we had passed, that we were now officially guardsmen of the Astra Militarum. There was no ceremony, no congratulations. Just the curt acknowledgement that we had not died and therefore we were useful. We were issued regimental insignia, patches that we sewed onto our uniforms, and dog tags, metal discs stamped with our names and identification numbers. The dog tags were not for us. They were for whoever would eventually collect our bodies. We were assigned to the 83rd Mordian Iron Guard. The regiment had been under strength for months, depleted by continuous fighting, and we were the fresh meat brought in to fill the gaps. The veterans looked at us with a mixture of pity and contempt. They did not bother learning our names. A corporal named Venko, a woman with a face like carved stone and eyes that had seen too much, told us the rules. Follow orders. Never hesitate. Trust no one. She said the officers who gave the orders were safe in command bunkers, that our only job was to stay alive long enough to follow the next order, and that most of us would be dead within a month. Our first deployment was to a defensive line on a planet called Christ's 4. The planet was a contested world, meaning it was being fought over by multiple forces, and our regiment was tasked with holding a 40-kilometer stretch of fortifications while the Navy provided orbital support. The fortifications were a series of trenches and bunkers connected by communication tunnels, and they had been built and rebuilt so many times that the foundations were layers of human remains and broken equipment. We traveled to the line in Chimera transports, armored vehicles that rattled and shook over broken terrain, and the journey took 16 hours even though the line was only 80 kilometers from the staging area. The roads were cratered by artillery, and twice we had to wait while combat engineers cleared debris. I sat in the back of the Chimera and stared at the faces around me, and I saw the same hollow expression I had seen in the mirror that morning. We were already dead. We were just waiting for official confirmation. The defensive line was under constant bombardment when we arrived. Shells screamed down from the hills and detonated in geysers of dirt and shrapnel, and we ran from the chimeras to the nearest bunker and threw ourselves through the entrance. The bunker was cramped and cold, water dripping from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and unwashed bodies. I found a corner and sat down, my loss gun cradled in my lap, and I tried not to think about what was coming. The routine was monotony punctuated by terror. We stood watch in shifts, manning firing slits in the bunker walls, staring out at no man's land and waiting for the enemy to appear. The enemy was chaos cultists, humans who had turned from the Emperor's light, and they attacked with suicidal fervor, screaming prayers to dark gods as they charged across the open ground. We cut them down by the hundreds, our loss guns turning the night into a light show of coherent energy, but they kept coming. I learned that killing humans felt different than killing xenos. The Tyranids had been alien, their biology and behavior so removed from humanity that I could almost pretend they were not alive. The cultists were human. They bled red. They screamed in languages I understood. When I shot them, I could see their faces contort in pain, could see the lost bolts burn through flesh that was fundamentally the same as mine. And I learned to ignore this, to keep firing, because acknowledging their humanity meant acknowledging my own, and that way led to madness. The casualties mounted with relentless efficiency. Our platoon lost 6 men in the first week, all of them killed by sniper fire that came from somewhere in the ruins beyond the line. Venko did not mourn them. She simply redistributed their equipment and requested replacements. The replacements arrived 3 days later, terrified recruits who looked even younger than I felt, and they were dead within 48 hours, killed by a mortar strike that landed directly on their position. I stopped counting the dead. The numbers were meaningless. What mattered was that the platoon was shrinking, that we were being ground down, and that no one seemed to care as long as the line held. I learned to function without sleep, to stand watch for 18 hours straight, to survive on 2 hours of rest grabbed in intervals too short to dream. I learned to eat anything, to drink water that tasted like rust and chemicals, to ignore the pain of blisters and infections because the medici supplies were reserved for injuries that prevented combat effectiveness. The commissar was a constant presence. His name was Ravik, and he walked the trenches with his bolt pistol drawn, his eyes scanning for signs of weakness or dissent. He was a tall man, thin and severe, with a voice that could carry over artillery fire, and he executed a man for falling asleep on watch, shooting him in the temple and leaving the body as a warning. Ravik explained that discipline was the only thing that separated guardsmen from animals, that without it we would collapse into chaos, and that he would personally ensure we maintained it. I hated him, but I also feared him, and that fear was stronger than hate. So I obeyed. I watched him execute a man for hesitating to follow an order, watched him shoot a woman for questioning a tactical decision, and I kept my head down and my mouth shut because survival was more important than principles. The enforcer I had been would have been disgusted by this cowardice. The guardsman I had become understood that cowardice was intelligence. The enemy adapted. After the first month, their attacks became more sophisticated, more coordinated. They began using artillery that could reach our positions, and the bombardments intensified, turning the defensive line into a hellscape of fire and debris. We lost an entire bunker in the 6th week, the structure collapsing under a direct hit, and the 30 men inside were buried alive. We heard them screaming through the rubble, their voices growing fainter over the course of hours, and no one attempted rescue because the shelling had not stopped. Eventually the screaming stopped. We marked the bunker as lost and redistributed the survivors to other positions. I took a lost gun power pack from the wreckage, and I cleaned it carefully, and I used it without thinking about whose hands had held it before mine. The living needed ammunition more than the dead needed memory. The food situation deteriorated. Supply convoys were being hit by enemy raiders, and the rations that did arrive were spoiled or insufficient. We were put on half portions, then quarter portions, and hunger became a constant companion. Men fought over scraps with a desperation that bordered on madness. I learned to scavenge, searching the bodies of the dead for ration bars or canteens, and I felt no shame in this. The dead had no use for food. A veteran named Kor taught me to eat things I would never have considered before. Grubs from beneath rocks. Roots dug from the churned earth. Even the flesh of the enemy when there was nothing else. I tried it once, a piece of meat carved from a cultist we had killed. It tasted like rancid fat and made me sick for days. But I survived. That was all that mattered. The weather turned. The dry heat gave way to freezing rain, torrential downpours that turned the trenches into rivers and flooded the bunkers. We stood watch in water up to our knees, our uniforms soaked, our skin wrinkled and pale. Men developed trench foot, their flesh rotting inside their boots, and the medici had no supplies to treat them. They simply cut away the dead tissue and sent the men back to the line. I developed a cough that would not go away. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass, and I coughed up blood most mornings. But I kept my lost gun clean and my head down, and I told myself I had survived worse, even though I could not remember when. The morale collapsed in the 4th month. Men stopped caring about anything beyond the next meal or the next hour of sleep. The Imperial Creed became a hollow joke. When the mini-storm priest came to deliver a sermon, he was met with silence or open hostility. Venko warned us to keep our mouths shut, that Ravik was watching, but the warning was unnecessary. We were too tired to rebel, too broken to care. The orders came down in the 5th month. We were to advance, to push the enemy back from their positions and establish a new defensive line 10 kilometers forward. The order was framed as a strategic offensive, but everyone knew it was suicide. Advancing across open ground against an entrenched enemy was a death sentence. But we prepared anyway, checking our loss guns, securing our equipment, because disobeying meant execution. We advanced at dawn. The artillery provided covering fire, shells screaming over our heads and detonating in the enemy positions, and we ran across no man's land while the cultists fired at us from their trenches. Lost bolts sizzled through the air, close enough to feel the heat, and men fell around me, their bodies tumbling into the mud. I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs cramping, and I made it to the enemy trench and jumped in. The fighting was brutal and close. I stabbed a cultist with my bayonet, feeling the blade punch through his ribs, and I pulled it free and turned and shot another in the face. The lost bolt burned through his skull and he dropped. I kept moving, clearing the trench section by section, and when my lost gun ran dry I picked up a cultist's weapon, a crude autogun, and I used that until it jammed. We took the position. Of the 200 guardsmen who had advanced, 73 survived. We held the position for 3 days. Then the orders came down to withdraw, to return to our original line because command had decided the forward position was not strategically valuable. We had lost 127 men to capture ground we were now abandoning. No one questioned this. We simply followed orders. The war on Christ's 4 lasted 9 months. We held the line, advanced, withdrew, held again. The regiment that had numbered 3,000 when I arrived was reduced to 800. I watched entire companies die, watched the trenches fill with corpses, watched the planet's surface turn into a graveyard. And eventually, the enemy withdrew or was destroyed or simply ran out of bodies to throw at us, and we were declared victorious. Victory felt like nothing. We were pulled back to a staging area and told we would be redeployed in 2 weeks. The survivors sat in silence, their faces hollow, their eyes empty. We had won, but we had lost everything that made winning meaningful. We were tools that had been used, and now we were being prepared for use again. I have been a guardsman for 3 years now. I have fought on 11 worlds, killed more enemies than I can count, and survived battles that should have killed me dozens of times over. I have been wounded 8 times, starved, frozen, burned, and diseased. I have watched entire regiments die around me, and I am still here. Not because I am skilled or lucky or blessed by the Emperor, but because I have learned to obey without question, to suppress everything human inside me, to become the component the Imperium needs me to be. I do not dream anymore. I do not think about the future. I do not imagine a life beyond the Guard. I am Vex Corian, former enforcer, current guardsman, and I have learned the only lesson the Guard has to teach. The Imperium is a machine that consumes humans and calls it holy. I used to be on the outside of that machine, feeding people into it, believing I was necessary. Now I am inside it, being ground down, and I understand that there is no difference between the enforcers and the conscripts, between the torturers and the victims. We are all fuel. We are all being burned to keep the engine running. And the engine does not care how we feel about it. Survival is not heroism. It is not even victory. It is simply the temporary absence of death. And I carry that knowledge with me every day, a weight that grows heavier with each passing hour. The machine is still running, and I am still inside it. And when I finally stop being useful, when my body breaks or my mind shatters or I simply make one mistake too many, the machine will discard me without hesitation and pull in someone new. That is what the Imperium does to ordinary people like me. It does not create heroes. It creates corpses. And it calls them glorious.